All right, so everyone, welcome. Go ahead and get our final project documents up on the screen so we can review them together. So for our 201 students who we're starting with, the good news is that if you've submitted all of your milestones, all three of them, you have actually covered everything you need to cover. So there are no more elements that you need to add to your paper. Everything that you're going to be doing from this point on is just revision. So that's what we're going to spend our time tonight focusing on. So let me pull up, make sure I get the right one. Let's see. I have to name these better so I don't confuse them. Okay, perfect. So what I usually like to do when we go over the final project for this course, because there are no new elements, is to spend some time with the rubric. So as we've talked about on the other webinars, if you were able to join us or watch the recordings, is that the expectations for the final project are a little higher than they are for the milestones. So the milestones, in a sense, are treated a bit like a rough draft, and this, of course, is your final submission. So for each of the rubrics for the milestones, you would notice that there are only 3 levels of performance, the highest one being proficient. Now for the final project, now that you've had a chance to revise each of those elements, we've got a new high mark, and that is, I believe it's entitled Exceeds Expectations. I don't want to speak out of turn. Let's scroll down to it. I'm sorry, exemplary. Exceeds Expectations was on a former iteration of rubrics from before this course was redesigned a couple years ago. So the exemplary column is now the new top mark for getting full credit on any individual element. So you notice that the proficient column is still here. The descriptions are the same. The descriptions for needs improvement are the same for any critical element. And the description for not evident is, of course, the same. So ideally, this is something that, and I recommended this in former webinars, and hopefully your instructors have encouraged you to look at it too. But hopefully you've already given some thought to what this exemplary column is asking you to do even before you've gotten to the final project. But if you haven't, that's absolutely fine. Now is the time where you can really familiarize yourself with these new expectations and see if you can sort of aim for that exemplary mark with your work here on the final project. So there's a few that I want to point out. A lot of them are often simply asking you to give additional detail or additional examples to really solidify your point. So here we are. I'm going to start at actually the very first one, because this is one where there are a few of them, and those are the ones that I'd like to focus on for our purposes here, where you will most likely have to make a revision. A lot of students really knock it out of the park in their milestone with some of these elements, and you might already be at exemplary based on your performance from your milestone, and maybe you don't have to make any revisions. But for some elements, more likely than not, you weren't totally prepared because of the timing of the course to have an exemplary performance on that element. And so now is the time where you would go back and make those edits. So the very first one, your introduction, is actually the purpose statement in your introduction is one of those elements. So when you wrote this, it was only week 2, and you hadn't done a lot of research on your company, naturally, because we were just starting out the course and it was your first milestone. So you'll notice that between proficient and exemplary, you go from outlining the purpose of the paper and how it will inform your conclusion, which is pretty standard, and you could keep it a little bit generic for the milestone and hit that proficient level. But you'll notice that when we read exemplary, you do have to get a little bit more specific, and now you ought to be prepared to do that. So exemplary for introduction purpose, which is the very first critical element up here, says meets proficient criteria and uses industry-specific language to establish expertise. So some of you might have already known your industry really well, if it's an industry you work in or you're really passionate about, or maybe you're a passionate customer. So maybe you already did know a lot about the industry, and you were able to include that in your purpose element in the milestone. But for those of you who are new to studying the industry that you chose, maybe you just really like the company but didn't know a lot about the industry in general, this might be a time where if you go back and read your purpose, you'll notice that you didn't use a lot of industry-specific language because you just you weren't familiar with it yet, and your purpose was a little bit generic. So now's the time where you do have that knowledge, you've researched the industry a lot, and of course the company, and you can add those sorts of details in and make that purpose, that intro paragraph that describes the purpose of your paper, a little bit more robust and a lot more specific to your company choice and the industry that your company works in. The next one is about your company choice, and that's kind of already chosen. So that one is, there's not much to say there for the history and overview. For conditions and impact, this is one of those ones that I mentioned is really just adding some more detail. The next one for under supply and demand conditions for the firm's actions is, again, giving well-qualified and concrete examples. You'll notice that that's a pretty common occurrence. So if you go through and read your feedback and read what you wrote from the milestone, see if there's any way that you can bring in a little bit more explanation, bring in additional examples, and explain those examples in more detail. But some of you might have already done a really super job on those and might not need to revise those. So Melissa asks, do we need an abstract? I don't see it in the rubric. So Melissa, you're right. There is no critical element that is specific to the abstract. The abstract would get captured, I'm scrolling down to it, simply under this very broad header of articulation of response. So any of the writing elements of your paper, grammar, spelling, the organization of your paper, the citations of your paper are all captured under articulation of response, and the abstract is included in that. So it is described, if we go up to the guidelines, and maybe Kate and Bill, if you know exactly where it is, it does ask that the paper be in APA format, which does typically include an abstract. I feel like somewhere it specifically says abstract. But as far as the grading is concerned, Melissa, and everyone else, it would be captured under articulation of response. So it's not graded on its own. I hope that answers your question. So. No problem. All right. So conditions, supply and demand section we've covered. That's one that, again, a lot of students are totally all set with, and then some students might have a need to add some more examples or some more detail. And Anna asks, is it okay to go over 9 pages? So I'm just going to scroll down so we have the rest of everything in front of us. But to answer Anna's question about length, to go over 9 pages is fine. 9 pages is more of an estimate just in terms of the text itself. Once you add in tables and graphs or any other visuals, most students are over 9 pages. So that's, and most students are including graphs because a lot of these critical elements require them. So if you are over 9 pages, that's fine, especially if your feedback has been good. If you're way over the amount of pages you should have, your instructor might have given you some feedback about some stuff you can take out. But because of the way that we're focused on grading these critical elements of the rubric, sometimes extra stuff just becomes extra, but you still meet the elements. So, if you're worried about length, if it's like way over 9 pages, if you're getting, over 15 pages, and you're worried that that's going to negatively impact your paper, I would talk with your instructor about it. But anything between 9 and 15 pages, once you add in, all the citations and any graphs and visuals, I think that's pretty standard. So the abstract, So Marjorie, that's probably fine. If you're at all worried at 16 pages that you have information in there that's not needed, you can talk with your instructor about it. Sometimes it depends on the company choice as well. If you have a company that maybe has a couple of different products and you had to focus on them somewhat separately, that might lengthen your paper too compared to somebody else. Like Netflix paper would be shorter than maybe a paper about Apple, because maybe Apple, you want to look at the iPad separate from the iPod, separate from the Mac computers. So that really depends. And then Sandra asks where the abstract should go. So the abstract will come after your title page, but before your actual paper begins. So it's on its own page, and it should look that way in the paper template that is available in the course, in the final project resource area. Yeah, Anna, if you're already at 16 and you're missing stuff, then it might just be that the examples that you've included and maybe any graphs and stuff you've included just happen to make your paper longer. So I would definitely follow your feedback from your instructor, and if you know that there are critical elements that you haven't addressed, then keep going. Anthony, when Bill said it's not required, it's not a specific critical element here that you're graded on. It is part, when we show you the template, it's shown there just as part of a standard APA format, but you're not graded on the abstract itself. So I hope that kind of clears that up. So the articulation of response here, I'll go back to that real quick. It's worth 2.5% of your grade. So I mean, if I still encourage you to do it, because it's what APA formatted papers typically have, and if your instructor is looking for that because they want to see that proper APA formatting, I would hate for you to lose points, but at the most it's probably not going to make or break your grade. So just in terms of being very pragmatic about it, I want you to understand the grading, but I would still recommend that you do it. So, especially because it's very short. It's only going to be, it's like a short paragraph long, just explaining what your paper's about. So it's a good exercise. Yeah, Marjorie, again, you're not really graded on the content of the abstract. I advise you to do it just as a good exercise and being able to explain in a short paragraph what your paper's all about, because that's something you're probably going to be asked to do later on. So this is a good kind of safe environment. No one's going to be reading your abstract and picking it apart and grading you specifically on that. So this is a nice, easy, safe way to practice doing it and kind of get your feet wet if you've never done it before. It's very low stakes since it's not its own element here in the rubric. And that way, when you're asked to do it, and it is a little bit more important in terms of your performance on a paper overall, you'll already have some experience with it. So I don't want anyone to stress about it, even though I think you ought to do it. It's just a few sentences, short paragraph, describing what your paper's all about. So it should be pretty simple once you've got your paper done. Something maybe you can save till the end once you've got all your revisions done. Then you will sort of refresh your mind about everything that's in your paper and can go ahead and just quickly write your abstract. All right, looks like Carrie is typing. Carrie, it is a little bit similar to the introduction to the paper. The introduction to the paper doesn't say what your conclusions are. So the abstract might call out a little bit more specifically what the conclusion will be. That would be the biggest difference. So a lot of the times, if you, probably not so much for this paper, since you're looking at a particular business, but when you do other sorts of research papers, you're going to find other academic papers written by people. And when you just a simple Google search and you find an academic paper and you pull it up, you're going to read the abstract. And in the abstract, they'll be longer than the one you have here in a lot of cases, but it will say what the conclusions are. And you'll often notice this if you ever read like a like a scientific kind of paper where they, do a specific science experiment and they've got conclusions. The abstract will describe the conclusions. So I think that's probably the biggest difference between the intro paragraph and the abstract. Connie, you can if you want. It's not, again, you're not going to be graded on the content of your abstract. It doesn't have its own growth element. Really, it's just there to say, did you include an abstract and tell your reader what the paper is going to be about? So you can absolutely reuse that line, and you can reuse a lot of the language from the introduction. That's fine. I would include some of your conclusions, though. So maybe, this paper looks at, does a microeconomic analysis of Netflix in order to recommend these couple suggestions for them moving forward as a company, whatever your paper ended up with in terms of recommendations and suggestions. There you go. Yep. It's okay if it's a little they all sound a little bit the same. That's okay. This is your first introduction to economics, and I know for a lot of us, writing these kinds of research papers is not something we're used to doing. So we like to have a sort of template there for people who haven't done this before. And then as you do it more often, you do it in your next class, the class after that, then you can maybe make things have like your own voice. But at the beginning, it's okay if we all sound a little bit the same as we get used to it and learn. So Connie asks if we should have a synopsis of each heading in the abstracts as well. No, it's just going to be one paragraph, Connie. Real simple. A couple sentences describing what the paper is going to do. Yep. And what conclusions it comes to. No problem. It also, Kate and Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, there is an example paper on Hershey that I'm pretty sure has an abstract, so you can read that as an example. That was done by one of the students in this class the first semester, the first term that it ran. So it's been a while since I read it, but I'm pretty sure she had an abstract. All right, so I want to scroll back up because there are a couple of critical elements that I do want to go over specifically to make sure nobody misses it. So in addition to a lot of the exemplary descriptors saying to add more detail or use additional examples, you'll see that a few of them, especially here in price elasticity of demand section, ask you to use research to illustrate your claims. So a lot of what you're doing here is taking our textbook theories and applying them to a real business. Really, that's the crux of our work in this course, and in this paper in particular. But it also helps to not just show to your instructor that you can take those theories and apply them in a real world situation, but that also that you find some research to support it. So that really bridges the gap between theory and real world. So you're applying what you understand about the stuff that we learned from the textbook and in the class to the real world. And then you find other research that backs it up and that really corroborates what you're saying. So you'll notice that in the first element of price elasticity of demand, exemplary is asking you to do that. And same thing with pricing decisions, that to use research to illustrate your claims. So that could be research done by other economists that they've done in the industry, or it could be research that you find, maybe pricing information that you find in these situations from the annual report, or from an industry magazine that's done a little bit of research into the company or the industry overall, that help support your application of the theory to the company that you've picked. All right. And if we go down to cost of production, profitability, you'll see again, looking for more examples to substantiate your claims. So that first one is a great one to, if you think that you aren't quite there yet, to just read through what you have and see, okay, can I be a little bit more specific about the cost that my company faces, the things that they spend money on, how the prices of those inputs have been changing over time, and how that's impacted the bottom line of my company. Have those costs been chipping away at profit, or has the company been able to keep making profit and keep increasing their profit even despite price increases of those inputs? Or maybe the input prices have gone down. So maybe if you're doing Southwest Airlines, a lot of people talk about gasoline prices have gone down in the past 5 or 10 years. Has that led to a bigger profit margin for them? So things like that. You can see if you can get more specific with those details about the costs instead of just looking at the costs as a whole. All right. Ooh, my thing is going crazy here. One of the things that I know we talked a little bit about this on the webinar last time, was with overall market, because some of the stuff didn't line up perfectly with our textbook reading. So again, that's why the milestone expectations are a little bit lower than for the final project. Now you've covered everything you need to know about all the different market structures. So now is a good time where if you didn't feel totally confident in applying some of that stuff that was introduced in week 6 in your paper, now is the time where you can come back and maybe fill in those gaps and make those elements a little bit more robust. So specifically, barriers to entry and market structure. So barriers to entry, everyone talks about in their paper because it's a critical element, so we all have to address it, but it's covered in our textbook in the section regarding oligopolies. So if you want to go back and check out this element after we've completed our week that covers barriers to entry as part of the oligopoly reading, this is probably going to be one of those ones where everybody should double check to make sure that there's nothing you can add to get to that exemplary level if that's what you're going for. And then market structure as well. If you have determined that your company is in an oligopoly or even a monopoly, then you might want to come back and see if there's anything you want to add to that element now that we've completed all of our reading on those 2 market structures. All right, so Carrie asks, if we follow all the instructor feedback, should we automatically be falling in line with exemplary? I know it depends on what they said, but mine was very specific. Yeah, so if your instructor gave you specific feedback, then you follow it, then you should get to the exemplary level. Yes, of course, that's not a guarantee, because perhaps the way that you interpret the feedback, I'm not, that's how it ought to be. Of course, the execution and the interpretation of the work that comes out of your execution is up to your instructor to decide if that does meet what they had in mind. So I don't want to put words in their mouth, but when they're giving you specific things to add, then that should be aligned with the exemplary expectations. Unless if you did get like a needs improvement and they gave you some feedback, then I would definitely recommend that you still read through the exemplary and make sure that you're trying to hit that, because they could have been focusing on getting you to the next level and making sure you hit that mark. So if you feel that you can definitely hit that mark with the specific detailed instructions that they gave you, then you might want to take it upon yourself to make sure that you're also at the exemplary level and see what the difference is between proficient and exemplary if you were at needs improvement, and try to get yourself there if that's your goal. All right, and Shirley has her hand raised. Shirley, if you want to type in your question in the chat, that would be great. We don't have audio for participants. I'm sorry, microphone rights for participants. And if we missed your question, I'm so sorry. I don't think so. So yes, so Shirley, if you want to type in your question in the chat, that would be great, and we can get to that. So the overall market ones, again, are ones that, especially for those of you who determine that the industry that your firm is in is either a monopoly or an oligopoly, you'll probably want to revisit and see if there's anything you want to add now that we've 100% completed our reading and discussion about those market structures. And of course, taking a look at your recommendations now that we've completed everything in the course in terms of things that are directly aligned with your paper, you might feel in a much better position to offer these recommendations and explain them. So I would really encourage everybody to come back to these. And of course, the most important thing, like Carrie just mentioned, is following your instructor's feedback. So if they tell you that you need to have more examples or go into more detail or use economic terminology, or if you maybe misapplied a concept, those are the things that you're going to want to tackle first and foremost. So once you've sort of gone through your instructor's feedback and made revisions based on that, then I think it's a really good exercise to go through the exemplary column and just see, would I say that the work I've done meets this? Or does it meet proficient? Or do I still think that I'm in the needs improvement column? And just gauge yourself from there. And if you think that you can get yourself to the next level by doing a little bit more research or writing a little bit more detail about a certain conclusion that you've come to or analysis that you're doing, then go ahead and add it. But at least you're giving yourself kind of like a check about where you think you are relative to the rubric, relative to your instructor's feedback and what you've produced. So you can feel, okay, I feel like I've reached my goal for what I want to get done here for this element, for all the elements, and I'm ready to submit my paper. Oh, Carrie, well, congratulations on getting married. That's really exciting. I hope you finish this before then, and I hope you're going on a honeymoon. Yeah, that is really terrible timing to be getting married in the middle of a term, but I'm sure that it's worth it. Very, very exciting. So that is that for what I wanted to share with you all tonight. Does anybody have any other questions before we move on to our macroeconomics class? All right, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. All right, well, everyone from ECO 201, thank you so much for joining us. And ECO 202 students, welcome. I'm very happy to have you all here with us. We do have some new stuff to go over. So I'm going to stop sharing from 201 and bring up our 202 stuff. Let me see let me make sure I get the right document here. No, this is not the one I want. This is your rubric, which we will talk about, but first I do want to talk to you all about the new elements that you're adding for your final project. Here we go. All right, so I'm going to scroll up to the top just so we have everything in order. So this is the guide for your project for ECO 202 that we've been sharing in all of these webinars, and hopefully you've been using as sort of a backdrop to help you make sure that you include everything you need to include for each of the elements. So in the past 3 milestones, you've completed most of the intro part of your presentation, which is focused mostly on the data. And you've completed the fiscal policy section and the monetary policy section. So for the final project, you have 4 critical elements to add. 2 of those are part of the data section, and they're focused on foreign trade. And then the last 2 that are being added are part of the conclusion part of your project. So just to keep things aligned with how the rubric lays it out for the final project, you notice that you have your title slide, you've got your 10-year overview slide, which really is just an overview slide. You're not graded on this. This is just sort of added to help give you a little bit of guidance about what you're going to focus on in terms of what happened in your time period. So that comes next. And then your GDP slides, which you've already done, your unemployment and inflation slides, your interest rate slides. And then this is where milestone 1 ended. But then you'll notice that we don't go straight to fiscal policy from here. There is a new element, which is what you're going to add in here. And the nice thing about slides is you can just move them around. So you can write these new elements and just move the slides so that they're ordered in this way. All right, hang on, Tanya. I will get to that in 1 second. So foreign trade, imports and exports is the first one. And there are 2 that have to do with foreign trade. So this first one is focused on the data. So you're going to provide the data on levels of imports and exports throughout your time period. So these should be annual numbers. There's a couple different ways that students choose to show this, or they choose to show it more than one way. They'll either show it as dollars, which should always be in inflation adjusted real dollars, or you can present them as a percentage of GDP. Those are the typical ways that students present it. There's no right or wrong way, but whatever you choose, just make sure that in your speaker notes that you're explaining what we're seeing in the graph and which it is, and the importance of each. So for most students, they actually I'm not sure if it's most, or it might be split down the middle, but some students have their exports and imports graphs separate, and some students have them together. It doesn't matter. You can have them together or separate. I think I would recommend that you do them separately instead of just showing net exports, because we do want to see the movement of each separately. So I would encourage you not to combine them into net exports. So once you've got your data, which Tanya has a question about. So once I explain sort of the generic stuff, Tanya, I'll jump to your question specifically about the 1970s. So in your analysis of the data, you're going to make connections to other aspects of the economy, such as the exchange rate. So we've got a little quick explanation here of how exchange rate might impact trade, and other things impact trade too, which we're going to get you'll get into on the next element. But basically, you're going to show your data, and just like you did with those other elements from milestone 1, you're going to give a little bit of explanation of why we see the movements that we see. All right, and we've got some links here. These links might be the ones that Tanya is having some problems with. I don't know if I click them here, if you guys will be able to see what I click into, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So the next element is on foreign trade models. So this is asking you to, once you've got your data and you've sort of explained what we see in the graphs of exports and imports, you're going to explain how this fits into some of the macroeconomic models that we've developed over the course. So one of the major ones is just looking at the general aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which you're probably a little bit bored of by now. It's really the workhorse of what we've done here, just like our supply and demand model from microeconomics. It's very flexible and can explain a lot of what we see. So us shifting that aggregate demand line around really does a lot for us, and this is another example of that. Of course, it's not the only thing that you can use to talk about how trade is connected to some of our economic models. You can also talk about comparative advantage here, which is one of the oldest economic models or economic theories, and so that can be applied too. So talking about the US, the comparative advantages that we had during your time period and how that impacted what we traded, what we exported, and of course our trading partners, what their comparative advantages were, and how that led to what they exported to us. So there are some different ways you can take it. And if you want to talk about both of these things, that's great too. So to talk specifically about getting the data, I'm going to click on one of these links, and you guys let me know if you can see it. I don't think it's going to, no. I'm pretty sure you cannot see what I'm seeing. If you can let me know in the chat, you probably still just see the models, right? Yeah, okay. Give me a sec. I'm going to stop sharing this real quick. And then I'm going to share my screen. Okay, bear with me. Here it is. All right. Can everybody see? I can't see the chat anymore. Can you guys see my this trading economic site? Oop. I'm going to give it a second. Now you can see it. Okay, great. So this is the reason that I think we shared this one is I think it went back to the 50s. And I feel like at the time, the Fred website, if for some reason I feel like when we made this template, it didn't go all the way back to the 50s, which is why we chose this one. You can get this data on Fred. So, especially for the 1970s. So students who pick the 1950s might still need to use the site. I'll check out Fred in a second. But to adjust the data, the time period, I believe you go here. Wait, no, that's not right. I'm sorry, you go to this calendar icon. And so you can type in, you know, January 1st, 1970. Oh, for Pete's sake. Jeez. Well, I really made a mess of that, haven't I? Okay, 1970, January 1st. And then do the same thing and just go to 1979 or 1980, January 1st. And then click OK. And here you've got your line graph. So you can just take a screenshot or, you know, I think that's probably the easiest way to do it is to just take a screenshot if you just want to include this graph right here. And then, you know, you can talk about what you see clearly. This is exports, I believe. You know, exports are increasing, and you see some dips here, and then it's got the biggest increase at the end. So in your analysis, you're going to talk about, you know, why do we see some of these? You know, here's a bigger increase, and then it flattens out, and then another bigger increase. What was happening during those times in trade that we saw this pattern in our exports? Okay, great. You can also, it looks like Melora's all set. Did I miss? I just want to, okay, so Tanya, you had the question originally, Tanya. So hopefully that answered your question. So here you go. This should do the trick. It tells you, so the data is from the US Census Bureau. So if you want to actually get the hard numbers, you can go to the US Census Bureau website. I believe they give it to you in a table. Personally, I prefer graphs because it's easier to see the ups and downs and the kind of the severity of the ups and downs. Whereas if you present your data in a table, especially in a PowerPoint presentation, I just don't think it carries the same weight. So if you get the data in a table from the Census Bureau, if you actually just want the annual numbers, I would recommend that you then put them in your own graph. If you're not going to grab the graph from here, you can also, and please tell me if this, if you guys can still see this. I'm going to Fred. Yeah, the Census Bureau, yeah, I think it breaks it down a lot of times by like month, and it can get a little bit tricky. So, but you can always go to Fred as well. So I'm just here, the general Fred site. I can type in exports, really basic, and it'll give me a bunch of different time series. So I don't want net. So I'm going to go to real export, so I can get it in real dollars. And so it does go to, and you've got all these ones. It does go back to 1947, so this should be just fine. And then Fred is even easier to work with, in my opinion. You can just move these little tabs here to the side. So if you wanted to go to the 70s, I could just go right up to 1970, voila, and bring this up to 1980. Boom. And I've got a very similar graph to what we saw before. We saw an early increase, and then it flattened out in the middle, and then a later increase. Okay, so Donna's having the same problem. So I don't know specifically, other than, the Census Bureau does track, the kinds of things that were being exported at that time. You could look at any trade agreements that were arranged during that time in the 70s. And if you're still struggling just from your own kind of standard researching through a browser, just like a Google search, what I would recommend is that you touch base with the library, because they're really good at helping find that kind of research. Yeah, that can say, okay, well, why did these, why did the exports increase during that time? And also, if you think about, and this goes a little bit back to our models, and which technically is the second element, but they're going to be a little bit linked, is if the U.S. economy is, and its trading partners are generally doing well, especially if our trading partners are doing well, then they're going to demand more of our goods. If their economies are strong, they've got excess money to spend, they're going to buy more stuff in general, which means buy more of our stuff as well. So that is sometimes the story. Another thing is the exchange rate. So Donna, you and anyone else who's having trouble, I would encourage you to take a look at the exchange rate during this time. So you can go up here and you can look at exchange rate. And there are a couple different ways to look at it. Of course, there's an exchange rate specific to another currency. So the US euro exchange rate or the US yen exchange rate. But lucky for us, Fred also does an index exchange rate. So basically compares us to like a basket of other currencies that are our major trading partners. So that's what you've got here, the trade weighted US dollar index. So if we wanted to look at that, actually, no, this only goes back to the 90s. Let's try this one. This one goes back to 1973. So that doesn't get your whole time period if you want to look at the trade weighted index, but it's pretty close. It'll certainly give you the story of how the currency was moving. So if we go back to 1980, you can see some movement in the exchange rate. So when the US dollar depreciates, so it loses value relative to other currencies, that makes our stuff cheaper for people in other countries to purchase. So we would tend to see our exports go along with that. And you'll notice here in the late 70s, there is a dip. And that was also correlated to, we saw an increase in exports. So that could be an explanation. I mean, without a very detailed, high-level macroeconomic analysis, you're not going to be able to say definitively. But since this is an intro class, that's not exactly what we're looking for. So this would be a simple case to make. You can say, starting in late 1977, the exchange rate, the US dollar depreciated against, our trading partners, and we saw an increase in our exports during that time. That would be one explanation for what you see in the graph. And you could show this graph too, if you wanted, or you could just, state the change that it had. So I hope that answers your question. So I think between doing something like this, looking at the economies of the US, because that's going to impact our imports, looking at the economies of our trading partners, and you can find out who we traded with. That data is out there as well. And then looking at the exchange rate, those are some places to start. And if you still feel like you don't have enough detail, then I would encourage you to touch base with the Shapiro Library, and they can help you with some research about trade during that time. We also have, and again, Kate and Bill, I keep asking you guys this. I don't know if either of you are teaching macro this term, but if you are, I believe that the final project resources guide, I'm sorry, the final project, the supplemental area in your course where it says final project resources, I believe it's called. It has a pretty lengthy paper in there about US trade, like for the past 100 years. I forget the exact title of it right now. So that might help give you some information too. And then you can also look at that paper's references, their bibliography, to see what resources they use to talk about trade in your time period. So, trade in the 1970s, or, maybe right before, right after that time period, to see how things were moving, and then use those sources as your own to give you some more information about trade in your time period. So those are kind of my first top 4-5 suggestions. So Eric asks, if the dollar is low, then export goes up or down. So yes, if dollar depreciates, loses value, then that makes our stuff cheaper, so exports will go up relatively. So right now, if it's $1 US to $1 Canadian, let's say, and then tomorrow you only need 90 cents Canadian money to get $1 of US stuff. Well, now they're going to be buying tons of Levi's jeans because now they only need to spend 90 cents on every dollar to get the same stuff. So they basically get a 10% discount from today if they buy it tomorrow after we depreciate. Okay, that's what it's called. Thank you. U.S. trade policy since 1934. Thank you. So that paper is available to everybody as sort of a jumping off point on trade and trade policy that covers all of our decades. And even if they don't have a ton of specific stuff about your decade, if you are looking for more, I would check out their references to see the stuff that they're using for their information, and then you can go to those more specific sources. Jessica, I'm sure it wasn't just the exchange rate. I don't want to definitively say what controlled trade throughout the 70s. I'm sure there were a lot of things that influenced it. Of course, the 70s domestically here saw stagflation. So we had a lot of unemployment, we had high inflation, and I'm sure that inflation affected other countries as well, because a lot of it was driven by oil, which is, of course, a global commodity. So I'm sure there's a lot going on there that pushed things in different directions. But also trade policy is going to play a major role too. And even, technological advances. Being able to ship things cheaper and faster can impact trade a lot, that sometimes we overlook. So just having bigger and better ships or airplanes and ways to get things from point A to point B can make a big difference. So those are the sorts of things that you'll want to look at. It's not just usually one thing that pushes trade in any one direction or the other. Generally speaking, I will say that trade has just grown as a portion of GDP, and you can see this if I go back to that other graph. It's just become a bigger part of all major economies. So in the 1950s, anybody who's doing the 1950s, you probably look at trade and be like, it was kind of a blip. It doesn't seem to be a really big deal here. Whereas if you're looking in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, it becomes a huge part of our economy. So that trend is definitely apparent throughout. That general trend towards more and more and more trade. more exports and imports, even though, of course, we all know that we have a trade deficit. That's, I think, pretty widely known, even by people not taking macroeconomics. Even though we might import more than we export, we're always exporting more and importing more all the time, decade over decade. It's just one tends to go faster than the other. So you'll see here, this is the real exports, goods, and services in real dollars. So this is chained to 2009 dollars. So you can see that it's, it just really takes off, starting really in the 80s. So even the 70s, we see an increase, but it's not huge. It's not really until the 80s. The big deal there for anyone doing the 80s is, of course, trade opening up with China. So that's a big part of it. But there's other things too. Just general globalization becoming a bigger part of the economy and of everybody's economies, in the more modernized countries. So this is the trend. And you'll see these dips here go along with the recessions, which are these shaded areas. And that's just because there's less spending overall. So there's less spending on our trading partners aren't buying from us as much. So. Yeah, Jessica. So the inflation in the 70s, I think, you can probably find some information about how that impacted trade. I mean, certainly from a supply side perspective, when the price of oil is very high, that impacts a lot of industries and makes everything very costly. And of course, shipping. So shipping becomes very costly when oil prices are high. So I don't know the exact details of that. I'm more just speaking hypothetically. You would want to do the research and get the data to see if that's actually how it played out. But I think that could be, that could tell part of the story of what went on in the 70s. So I would look into that. So Shirley asks, do we have to use the Fred site? I already did my graph. No, you don't have to use the Fred site, Shirley. So I showed the trading economics site before, and hopefully you caught that. And I showed how to adjust the dates, and you can just take a screenshot just of that. But I know some people said they had some trouble with it, so I wanted to show how to do it here too. All right. I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint slides, unless anybody wants me to show them anything else while we're here on Fred. I'm happy to take requests because I know that sometimes students have a hard time navigating it, and maybe seeing me jump around will help. Awesome. Okay. Oh, this, Tanya, this is just in dollars, in real inflation adjusted dollars, level of exports, US exports. So this would be your export one. And the neat thing about Fred, actually, let me show you this while we're here, because this isn't totally intuitive. You can add, another data series. So I can add a line, I can add imports. I'm just going to type in imports. I don't know what the name of it. So I want it to match up. So I want it to be real imports of goods and services. So I'm going to click right there, add data series, and just like that. Now I can just grab this graph and I can adjust it to my time. Let's say, I'm doing 75 to 85. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. I've got my 10-year graph. And you can see, this is actually neat. Here, for a short period of time, we don't really have a trade deficit. And then we do again. So that's just, I don't have a story for that without doing some research myself. This was at the very high point of when we had to raise our interest rates quite a bit. For anybody who did this time period, you already know that, but after inflation got to be way too high, they decided to take some strict monetary policy, and they raised interest rates a lot to combat the inflation. And that was in the early 80s, so that might have something to do with this. But yeah, it's a cool feature of Fred that you can add lines together. Just like I did, you can add way more. You can add another line. I could add GDP here, although that would just blow everything out of proportion because GDP is still much bigger than trade in general. But yeah, you don't even have to know what it's called. You just add a line, you put in your search term, and then it will give you a whole list of things that match up with that search term, and you pick the one you want. So that's pretty neat. Okay, I'm going to go back to the to our PowerPoint slides. Okay, let's get that document back up. So we've already talked about the two foreign trade elements. So clearly we're all good with the data. And again, it doesn't matter where you get the data as long as it's accurate. So the link here to that site is accurate. It all comes from the Census Bureau, even though that's not the Census Bureau website. And the FRED data is, of course, accurate. They also get it from the Census Bureau. They're the ones who are in charge of the data. So whichever site you feel more comfortable with, if you've got it from another place, as long as it's the accurate data, then you're good to go. And don't forget to cite it. So we talked about our trade models. And again, we've got some examples of what you could talk about on here. Comparative advantage and aggregate demand, aggregate supply are the most obvious ones. So you've already done your fiscal policy. That was milestone 2. That comes next when you organize your final project. So you've got those few slides, and then the monetary policy slides, which I have a double of here. And then are your last 2 elements that you're adding. So the first is general conclusion. Conclusion really isn't the right term. It should probably be called summary, but in this element, you're going to summarize the data, the history, and the policy analysis of the time period. So to do a good job here, you want to talk about, just call out the major policies and major data points. So if your time period had a recession or maybe more than one recession, you want to talk about that. If unemployment was a big deal during your time period, you'll want to talk about how high did it get. If inflation was a big part of the economy during your time period, you want to talk about how high it got. What was the peak? When did that peak happen? What was done, on the policy side, what was done to ameliorate that? So you should know at this point what the major stories were from a data perspective, from a historical perspective, and from a policy analysis perspective. And when I say historical, I mean historical in the things that had to do with or affected the economy, not just general historical. So, if there was some event that happened, like 9/11, that had an impact on the economy, this is the time where you would bring that into your summary, something like that. So, a couple questions. So MK asks, do we just combine all of these milestones and the citations all together in one file? Yep. So that's exactly what you're going to do. So it should look just like this when you're done with it. PowerPoint makes it really easy from different files to just copy paste a slide into a new file. So you can just maybe start with milestone 1. You're going to add those 2 slides on foreign trade, and then you can just copy paste the fiscal policy slides into there, copy paste the monetary policy slides into there, and then add in your conclusion slides. So it will look like this. It's probably going to be about 20 slides, 25 slides long. You're going to have your title slide, which instead of saying a milestone, you'll actually just be the title slide now if it said milestone before. Your in-text citations are going to be the same. They're just going to be in their parentheses. That's not going to change. But your reference list, which I'll skip down to since you asked about it, we'll go here. So if you had references, if your reference page is different from, your milestone 1 had a couple of references and milestone 2 had some different references and milestone 3 a few different references, you're going to want to bring them all together. Just make sure you alphabetize them because that's the APA format. So there'll just be one reference slide here. So it is just going to be one long presentation. Again, probably based on what you have and what you have to add, it'll be about 20 to 25 slides. And then you also asked, what if your professor did not give you any feedback on previous milestones? Yeah, I would follow up with your instructor on that. Without seeing it myself, it could just be that, maybe you did a good job and they didn't feel they needed to give you any pointers, but I don't want to make that assumption without seeing anything. So if you feel like you didn't get any feedback, I would shoot your instructor an email, maybe even include your advisor to get some clarification. You're welcome. All right, so I'm going to go back to the conclusion. So this first one, again, is just a summary. Just like with all the other slides, you're going to want to have the main points on the slide with the explanatory detail in the speaker's notes. So that's the same here for these slides, just as it has been with all the other slides. This one, students almost universally do really well. And I think by the time you get to this point, you really sort of understand the ins and outs of what happened in terms of macroeconomics in your time period. So students tend to do really well here. The only thing that I find that some students might miss and might keep them from getting a totally perfect score in this element is not including specifics. They'll say unemployment was high. It's like, well, how high was it? So you have the data. It's really low-hanging fruit. If you're going to say that unemployment was high or was high in some year, tell me when and tell me how high. So include those kinds of specifics, and that's the kind of stuff that you would put right here, like maybe if you're making a bulleted list or you want to make like a table, or if you're maybe a little bit more artistic, you can make something kind of visually cool, but include those sorts of specific details. Especially when it's numeric stuff, you can easily put that on your slide and then give some explanation in the speaker's notes. And then last, I think this is where students tend to really like this part of the project. At least that's how I've interpreted the work students have done for me, is the agree disagree slide. So of course, economics has lots of opinions involved in it. And now that you've had almost a full term, we're almost done, of studying macroeconomics, being introduced to the topic in an academic setting, we want you to use what you've learned here in terms of the theories and your own analysis throughout this project, and discussions with your classmates and your instructor throughout the term to talk about whether you agree or disagree with some of the policies that were put in place in your time period. Of course, all of us are affected by policies that our government makes, and the economy is always going to be linked up with policies made by the government. Like that's just the nature of things. So it's important for us to understand how our study of economics feeds into all that. And this is your chance to give your opinion based on your learnings in this course, and not based on anything else. So you might have opinions outside of macroeconomic teachings, and that's fine. But this is our space to talk about how the models and the concepts that we've learned here might lead us to agree or disagree with an economic policy. So I think students enjoy having the chance to give their thoughts on something instead of just talking about research or looking at data. This is kind of your chance to kind of show what you know and show what you think about the decisions that were made at the time. And that is the last thing you've got to add, and then you're done. And again, this is one of those ones where I find that students do a pretty good job. The only way to really stray on this one is to not keep your arguments, this was a good policy, this was a bad policy, is to not give any economic reasoning. So again, maybe you disagree with the policy, but if your disagreement comes from something not having to do with economics, then that's not what we're looking for here. Even though it still might be a totally valid argument, we're looking for it from purely macroeconomic perspective. Do you disagree or agree with the policies that were put in place? And people might look at the same policy and come to different conclusions. Maybe in the short run it was good and that's why you agree with it, but someone else looks at the same policy and it's like, no, in the long run it wasn't good, so I don't agree with it. And both of those are based on some macroeconomic reasoning, hypothetically, but the two people can come to two different conclusions. So it's not that just using our models, it's a foregone decision. Oh yes, the model says you must agree or disagree with this policy. There are different ways of looking at it, even through that macroeconomic lens. So, you do have some space to have your own opinion where someone might disagree with you, even though you're both using the same tools. So do keep that in mind too. And we are already 5 minutes over. Sorry, we spent a lot of time with those graphs. But if anybody has any questions, I am happy to stick around and answer them. But I think we've covered everything. The only thing that I'll remind you of, and it's come up a little bit, but it's just to make sure that you go through all your feedback to revise from the milestones. So all the slides you've already submitted, hopefully you've gotten detailed feedback on them. Or if you did a really great job, your instructor said, hey, you've done a really great job, you don't need to revise anything here. And then you know where to spend your time. But read through all your feedback. If you have any questions about your feedback, you don't understand it, it wasn't detailed enough, you're not sure how to execute it because you can't find the right information, now is the time to reach out to your instructor. It's only Wednesday, you have until Sunday to submit this, so that's plenty of time to get your question to them, get an answer back, and start your work. So that's the most important thing. And then from there, of course, go through the rubric for the final project and see how you can make sure that your revisions are getting you up a level. So if you got a needs improvement score, you're going to try to move yourself up to proficient. And then if you're at proficient, you're going to try to move yourself up to exemplary. And of course, even if you're at a needs improvement now, based on your milestone scores, you can still aim for that exemplary as well. But reading those rubric descriptors is going to help you understand how to make those revisions, and maybe help you understand your instructor's feedback too. So looking at all that together, your work, your instructor's feedback, and the rubric, those three things together should help you finalize and get this done by Sunday. I'm so glad to hear that they've been helpful, Melora, these webinars. I think that you guys come with really great questions, and we get a lot of views. We post them on YouTube, as I'm sure you guys know. So it seems to be doing a good job helping students and feel less anxious. So Donna has a question. If the Feds intentionally created a recession to reduce inflation, would be something that would be on the agreed to. Yeah, so absolutely, Donna. So that I think you said the 70s you were doing, but I think the policy that you're referring to was technically the 80s, or 80, 81, that time frame. Maybe it was 79 that they did it. I forget the exact time when they pulled the trigger. But yes, so they increased interest rates very high. And that is a contractionary policy. So the higher you raise the interest rates, the more you're putting the brakes on the economy, so to speak. And they did that because inflation was so high. But the problem was that unemployment was also high as well, and it put us in a recession because now, businesses aren't taking out loans, people aren't able to afford car loans and mortgages, and so the economy starts to scale back, more people lose their jobs, and we're in a recession. But it did control inflation. So someone can say, great, it controlled inflation. I agree. And someone could say, no, it put people out of work, and that's not a good policy. So that's a perfect example. Because you're all looking at the same data and the same models, but you're coming to different conclusions. And a lot of that is just about priorities. And, and that's okay to have different priorities. And that's a lot of what politics and economics and the intersection of economics and politics is about. So perfect example. Yeah, and other times people might disagree with the policy because they didn't think it went far enough, and others might disagree with the policy because maybe it they didn't think it worked at all. So some people might look at the same policy that didn't work and say, I don't agree with it, it didn't work. And someone might say, oh, I look at this policy, it was good, it wasn't enough. It needed to be longer or bigger, and that's why it didn't work. So it wasn't that it was a bad idea, but it was that it wasn't a strong enough response. So there are different ways of looking at that sort of thing too. So that's a common way for people to look at the same thing through a macroeconomic lens and come to different conclusions. All right, well, it looks like we don't have any other questions. Thank you all so much for joining. Oh, wait, one more. Will Donna asks if we will rewatch the webinar to make. Oh, she tells me. Okay, sorry. It was Bill. Bill asked me a question. I'm sorry. What about those moves the Pats did in the off season? Yes or no? I don't know about that. I told you I as much as I love watching the Patriots, and I really do, I also enjoy the off season because my husband gets a little bit too glued to the television during football season. So I try not to pay. I try to enjoy this time, not thinking about football. Oh, is that what that is? Okay. Clearly I'm not watching enough local news.